Gary Gilmore wasn't your typical death row inmate. Unlike others who begged for mercy, he fought against appeals, rejected salvation, and faced death without regret. His murders had no pattern, no motive, just a man who killed for the sake of killing, with nothing to lose. And with his infamous last words, "Let's do it," he became a pop culture phenomenon, etching his defiance into history in a way few ever have. Early life. Gary Gilmore's story began in McCamey, Texas, where he was born on December 4, 1940. His family life was anything but stable. Frank, his father, was a man of constant anger and unyielding discipline. Gary and his siblings often had to deal with Frank's violent temper, and the effects were lasting. His mother, Bessie, on the other hand, while more nurturing, imposed a strict religious household that clashed with Gary's rebellious nature. The family moved frequently, chasing stability and financial freedom that never seemed to materialize. From town to town, the children struggled to make friends and find consistency. Gary, in particular, felt the impact of this nomadic lifestyle. According to sources, even as a child, he got into a heated argument with his parents that ended with shattered plates and broken appliances and terrified children. School was no refuge for Gary. From the beginning, he was labeled a troublemaker. He clashed with teachers, refused to follow rules, and often ended up in the principal's office. As Gary entered his teenage years, his frustration began to manifest in more destructive ways. Petty theft and vandalism became common occurrences, acts that gave him a fleeting sense of control in a world where he felt powerless. His first encounters with the law came during this period, with arrests for breaking into the cars of strangers and shoplifting. Each time he was caught, the cycle of punishment and rebellion grew stronger. Juvenile detention became a revolving door, and the interventions he received did little to address the underlying causes of his behavior. Instead of rehabilitation, these experiences reinforced his mistrust of authority and deepened his anger. Despite his struggles, Gary wasn't without ambition. He had a talent for drawing and often sketched detailed images that hinted at a creative mind. For a time, he entertained dreams of becoming an artist, even discussing the possibility of attending art school. But those aspirations always seemed just out of reach. Whether it was lack of support, financial constraints, or his own self-sabotaging tendencies, Gary could never take the steps needed to turn his dreams into reality. The creative potential he had remained untapped, buried beneath layers of frustration and anger. Gary's relationships with his family were complicated. He had moments of closeness with his mother, who tried to shield him from his father's wrath, but their bond was strained by her strict expectations. His siblings, too, were both allies and adversaries. While they occasionally banded together to weather Frank's outbursts, they also fought amongst themselves, competing for attention and resources in a chaotic household. As Gary grew older, these relationships became more distant. His anger and impulsiveness isolated him from the people who might have helped him, leaving him to navigate his struggles alone. By the time Gary reached his late teens, his behavior had taken a darker turn. His crimes became more frequent and bold, his temper more volatile. Alcohol and other substances entered the picture, further fueling his reckless behavior. The crimes. After years of drifting through life, Gary Gilmore's descent into crime became almost inevitable. Released from prison in April 1976 after serving over a decade for robbery, Gilmore seemed poised for a fresh start. His release was conditional upon living with a distant relative, his cousin Brenda Nickel, in Provo, Utah. Brenda, an optimistic woman with a strong sense of faith, hoped she could guide Gary toward redemption. However, Gary's demons proved difficult to tame. Provo was very different from the life Gary had known. Provo's deeply religious community offered stability, but it also imposed restrictions that felt suffocating to someone as volatile as Gilmore. He initially tried to adjust, taking a job at a shoe repair shop and even reconnecting with his family. Brenda encouraged him to attend church, but Gary's rebellious nature made it clear he wasn't interested in conforming. However, a significant turning point came when Gary met Nicole Baker Barrett, a young and strikingly beautiful single mother of two. Their relationship was intense, passionate, and chaotic. Nicole had her own struggles, including a history of troubled relationships, and Gary's volatile behavior quickly escalated into possessiveness and jealousy. Their love affair, which began as a chaotic romance, became a toxic spiral. By July 1976, Gary's life was in disarray. He had lost his job due to erratic behavior and began drinking heavily. His relationship with Nicole was on the brink of collapse, and his cousin Brenda, who had initially supported him, was growing increasingly frustrated with his refusal to change. Desperate for money and consumed by anger, Gary turned to what he knew best: crime. On the evening of July 19, 1976, Gary Gilmore, freshly out of prison and already on a destructive path, arrived at a Sinclair gas station in Orem, Utah. Armed with a .22 caliber pistol, he entered the small, brightly lit building where Max Jensen, a 24-year-old gas station attendant, was working the evening shift. Jensen, a soft-spoken young man known for his kind and easygoing nature, had recently graduated from Brigham Young University and was working at the station to support his young family. Jensen's shift had been quiet, with only a handful of customers stopping by. The station was located on a quiet road, a far cry from the bustling streets of nearby Salt Lake City. Jensen was alone that night, as he often was during his shifts, making him a vulnerable target for someone like Gilmore, who was desperate for money and willing to do anything to get it. Gilmore entered the station with a calm demeanor, his pistol concealed but ready. He approached Jensen and demanded money from the register. Jensen, startled but cooperative, complied immediately. The amount of cash in the till was small, only about 125s, but Gilmore's intent was far from satisfied. Without giving Jensen a chance to react, Gilmore ordered him to lie face down on the cold, hard floor. Jensen obeyed without hesitation. In a move both calculated and senseless, Gilmore raised his pistol and shot Jensen in the back of the head at point-blank range. The young man died instantly. There was no struggle, no attempt to fight back. Jensen had done everything Gilmore asked, yet the act was carried out with cold precision. Gilmore didn't say a word as he left the gas station, walking back to his car and driving off into the dark night as though nothing had happened. The murder was as shocking as it was inexplicable. Max Jensen was a man described by those who knew him as gentle, hardworking, and deeply committed to his family and faith. A recent graduate with dreams of building a better future, he was the type of person least likely to provoke violence. His murder left friends and family reeling, unable to comprehend the senselessness of the act. Jensen's wife, who was at home waiting for him to return from his shift, was devastated by the news. He had been married for less than 2 years and was preparing for the birth of their first child. Local law enforcement was immediately called to the scene, but clues were scarce. The crime appeared random, with no clear motive other than robbery. Witnesses from nearby businesses reported hearing a loud bang, but didn't see anything unusual. The small amount of money taken, combined with the execution-style killing, left investigators struggling to piece together the mindset of a killer who seemed to act without reason. For the quiet community of Orem, Jensen's murder was a wake-up call. The area, known for its low crime rates and family-friendly atmosphere, was unprepared for such a brutal act of violence. Residents were shocked, fearful that something so horrific could happen in their seemingly safe neighborhood. Gilmore's actions that night revealed a disturbing lack of humanity. He had no personal connection to Max Jensen, no vendetta, no anger, just a cold determination to satisfy his own immediate needs, no matter the cost. For law enforcement, the killing raised the stakes. They knew they were dealing with someone who wouldn't hesitate to kill again. Less than 24 hours later, on July 20th, Gilmore struck again. This time, his target was Benny Bushnell, a 25-year-old motel manager in Provo. Bushnell, like Jensen, was compliant and cooperative when Gilmore demanded money. After pocketing the cash, Gilmore ordered Bushnell into a back room. Echoing the same method as the night before, he shot Bushnell in the head at point-blank range. The brutality of the act left no doubt that Gilmore's spree was deliberate and calculated. Unlike the first murder, this one left behind critical evidence. Gilmore accidentally left his blood-stained shirt and shoes at the scene, linking him directly to the crime. Witnesses also reported seeing his distinctive Ford truck near the motel, further narrowing the list of suspects. Gilmore's downfall came swiftly. Aware that police were closing in, and he turned to Brenda for help. She was horrified to learn of the murders and, fearing for her own safety, alerted the authorities. On July 21, 1976, just a day after the second murder, Gary Gilmore was arrested. When police questioned him, Gilmore remained defiant and uncooperative. He didn't deny the crimes outright, but he offered no explanations either. His demeanor was cold, almost indifferent, as though the weight of his actions hadn't fully registered. Psychologists later examined Gilmore's mental state, suggesting a combination of antisocial tendencies, unresolved trauma, and impulsive aggression. His crimes were seen as the culmination of years of pent-up rage, self-destruction, and a complete disregard for human life. The murders sent shockwaves through Utah's tight-knit communities. Both Max Jensen and Benny Bushnell were young men with bright futures, their lives senselessly cut short. For Brenda Nicole, the ordeal was particularly harrowing. She had welcomed Gary into her home, believing she could help him turn his life around. Instead, she became a key figure in his capture, a decision that weighed heavily on her for years to come. Vigils were held, and residents struggled to come to terms with the violence that had shattered their sense of safety. The trial. Gary Gilmore's trial for the murders of Max Jensen and Benny Bushnell was as swift as it was sensational. From the moment he was arrested on July 21, 1976, Gilmore became a figure of intense media scrutiny, his cold demeanor and disturbing crimes captivating a nation that hadn't seen an execution in nearly a decade. Gilmore was charged with the murder of Benny Bushnell, with prosecutors focusing on this case due to the overwhelming evidence left behind at the scene. His blood-stained shirt and shoes, along with eyewitness accounts linking his truck to the motel, made it nearly impossible for him to claim innocence. Although Gilmore was also suspected in the murder of Max Jensen, the prosecution opted to streamline the process by concentrating on Bushnell's case, knowing it would likely lead to the same outcome. The trial began on October 5, 1976, in Provo, Utah. The courtroom atmosphere was tense, packed with reporters, spectators, and family members of both the victims and the accused. Gilmore, defiant as ever, seemed indifferent to the proceedings. His demeanor was cold and unrepentant. According to eyewitness reports, he would occasionally smirk, which made him a disturbing presence in the courtroom. The prosecution built a strong case, relying on physical evidence, witness testimonies, and Gilmore's own incriminating behavior. The defense, meanwhile, faced an uphill battle. Gilmore had shown little interest in cooperating with his attorneys, even refusing to plead not guilty. Instead, he insisted on accepting responsibility for his actions, a decision that stunned his legal team and further expedited the trial. After just 2 days of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. On October 7, 1976, Gary Gilmore was found guilty of first-degree murder. The swift verdict was met with little surprise, given the mountain of evidence against him. During the sentencing phase, Gilmore's actions once again shocked everyone. When asked if he had any final words before sentencing, he chose not to plead for mercy or express regret. Instead, he doubled down, requesting the death penalty. His exact words, "You sentenced me to die, let's do it," became infamous. The judge granted his request, sentencing him to death by firing squad. Utah was one of the few states that still allowed this method of execution, and Gilmore's preference for it only added to the media frenzy surrounding his case. Unlike many inmates sentenced to death, who spend years or even decades filing appeals, Gary Gilmore had no interest in delaying his execution. In fact, he actively fought against attempts to appeal his sentence, declaring that he wanted to die as soon as possible. His stance made him a polarizing figure, with some praising his acceptance of justice and others questioning the ethics of carrying out his sentence. Gilmore was transferred to Utah State Prison, where he awaited execution. His time on death row was marked by a series of dramatic and bizarre events. His relationship with Nicole Barrett, which had already been tumultuous, took on an almost Shakespearean quality. Nicole, devastated by the situation, attempted suicide multiple times during this period, and her letters to Gilmore became a lifeline for both of them. The two exchanged passionate and emotional correspondence, with Gilmore professing his love for her even as he faced the end of his life. Gilmore's case quickly became a media spectacle. The fact that he was the first person sentenced to die after the U.S. Supreme Court reinstated the death penalty in Gregg v. Georgia added historical significance to his execution. Journalists from around the country descended on Utah, eager to cover the case and the man at its center. The final 24 hours. As the clock counted down to January 17, 1977, Gary Gilmore remained steadfast in his decision to face execution. Unlike most death row inmates who exhaust every appeal, Gilmore had fought for his sentence to be carried out, rejecting delays and any attempts to overturn it. His final hours reflected a man who had made peace with his fate. On the night of January 16th, Gilmore spent time in quiet reflection. A priest visited him in his cell, and they spoke about religion and the afterlife, though Gilmore remained ambivalent about his beliefs. Despite the opportunity for spiritual solace, he showed little sign of remorse for his crimes. His focus instead seemed to rest on the inevitability of what was to come. In the early hours of January 17th, he sat awake in his cell, aware that the morning would mark the end of his turbulent life. The weight of this reality did not seem to unnerve him. Instead, he appeared calm and resolute, as though the prospect of execution brought him a sense of control he had lacked in life. As the prison began to stir, Gilmore maintained his composure. Guards arrived to prepare him, and his routine was methodical. He shaved, dressed in fresh clothes, and sat quietly in his cell. When asked about his last meal, Gilmore initially joked about requesting 6 packs of beer, but eventually opted for a simple breakfast of eggs, hamburger, potatoes, and coffee. He ate without comment, treating the meal as just another part of the day. While Gilmore projected a calm demeanor inside the prison, the atmosphere outside was chaotic. Protesters had gathered, some advocating against the death penalty, while others supported the execution as a necessary act of justice. The debate surrounding Gilmore's case had divided the nation, with his execution representing the first in the United States since the Supreme Court reinstated the death penalty in 1976. Inside the prison, tension mounted among the staff. Guards carried out their duties with quiet resolve, fully aware of the historical significance of the moment. The legal battles that had delayed Gilmore's execution, including a last-minute stay issued the previous night, were still fresh in everyone's minds. However, the Supreme Court had overturned the stay at 7:30 a.m., ensuring that the execution would proceed as planned. Meanwhile, Gilmore spent these final hours writing letters, including one to Nicole Barrett, the woman whose tumultuous relationship with him had defined much of his later life. Despite being separated and her recent admission to a psychiatric hospital, Gilmore's feelings for her remained intense. His letter was short but emotional, urging her to escape the pain that had consumed both of them. Gilmore also interacted with prison staff, maintaining his composure and even making a few dark jokes. He had made it clear that he wanted to face his fate without fear or regret. At 7:53 a.m., Gilmore was escorted from his maximum security cell to the execution site. The journey was brief, less than a mile, but it marked the final steps of a long and tumultuous life. The site, an abandoned cannery, repurposed as the death house, was stark and functional, designed to facilitate executions with minimal ceremony. Inside the execution chamber, Gilmore was strapped into a chair. Nylon straps secured his arms and legs, and a wall of sandbags was positioned behind him to absorb the bullets. Despite his repeated requests to face his death standing and without a hood, both were denied. He would remain seated with a black hood placed over his head. The audience for his final moments was carefully selected. Among the witnesses were his Uncle Vern, filmmakers like Larry Schiller, and his attorneys, Ronald Stanger and Robert Moody. Nicole Barrett, though invited, was absent, her mental health preventing her attendance. Journalists, barred from witnessing the event directly, waited nearby to report on what would become one of the most significant moments in modern criminal justice history. When the witnesses arrived, they found Gilmore calm and composed, already seated in the execution chair. Warden Sam Smith stood solemnly before him and began reading the death warrant. Gilmore listened without reaction, his gaze occasionally shifting toward the screen concealing the firing squad. When asked if he had any final words, Gilmore's response was immediate and chilling. "Let's do it." Those 3 words, which encapsulated his defiant attitude, became his obituary and would later inspire pop culture references, including Nike's famous slogan, "Just do it." At precisely 8:05 a.m., the execution team took their positions. The firing squad, composed of 5 anonymous marksmen, stood behind a screen to ensure anonymity. Each was armed with a Winchester Model 94 rifle, loaded with 30 caliber cartridges. In keeping with tradition, one rifle was loaded with a blank round, allowing the shooters to avoid certainty over who fired the fatal shot. A prison doctor stepped forward to affix a white target over Gilmore's heart, ensuring that the marksman could aim with precision. The room fell silent as the team prepared to carry out their task. At the command, the rifles fired in unison. The bullet struck their target, causing Gilmore's body to jolt as the impact forced his head to turn slightly to the left. His hands twitched briefly before falling still. Within 20 seconds, all movement ceased. The prison doctor approached to confirm the outcome, checking for a pulse and listening for a heartbeat. At exactly 8:07 a.m., Gary Gilmore was pronounced dead. Gilmore's execution was not the end of his story. Within hours, his final request to donate his organs was honored. His corneas were transplanted, restoring sight to 2 individuals. This act of generosity stood in stark contrast to the violence and destruction that had defined much of his life. Norman Mailer's Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Executioner's Song, would later immortalize Gilmore's story, ensuring that his life and death would remain a topic of discussion for generations.